So this is my reading, commentary, and reflections on the Proverbs. We are in chapter 29. I finished last time with verse 10, and I'm going to continue now with verse 11. A fool utters all his mind, but a wise man keeps it in until afterwards. It's a fairly straightforward verse, but let's see what we can make of it, what we can do with it. The good old fool, one of the tropes that we see often in the Proverbs. Every time we see him, it's a good opportunity to reflect on who he is, where he is inside of us, but also maybe archetypally where he finds himself in our culture and society. So the fool is somebody who forgets to pray before they begin an episode. So I'd like to begin that now before we get into that. Dear Lord, I thank you that I can be here. I thank you that I could take this time to get myself out of the mental state of fatigue, of stress, perhaps, to a degree, out of that absence of mind for which I can all too easily fall into. And I'm thankful that regardless of where I am or how I am feeling, as long as there is the idea of putting aside something for the sake of you, for the sake of something greater, for the sake of the most important thing that life can offer, I am eternally grateful for that. And it is, at this moment, an experience that just a moment ago I felt that I had difficulty preparing my mind. But then I thought a prayer would be good now. This is something that will open the mind. It'll be something that, if done well, will reduce my selfish desire. Sacrifice an aspect of the self to become more one with you. And so with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So the fool. The fool is somebody who acts unwisely, a silly person. This is the formal Google definition. There is this idea of rest and of leisure throughout the Old Testament. We're introduced to it quite early on in Genesis. And this idea of rest, the idea of leisure, I think is fundamental to our experience. We need these events. We need these experiences regularly. We need them to orient ourselves differently. We need them to reset to a degree. That resetting is a return to a particular place, again, a particular orientation. I personally think that this is a way of orienting to God, that we put aside those eventual blinders of the deceit of the heart, or of the desires of the self, the self in general, as the ego expands and moves over our eyesight. A period of rest and a period of leisure, I think a productive period, is one in which we don't necessarily move into further absence, further blinding. It is something that does the opposite. It resets us. It removes those blinders so that we can appreciate that which is outside of ourselves, or outside of our immediate, not necessarily immediate responsibility, but immediate experience, I'll say. And the reason I mention that at least in part, is because the fool, I think, occupies the position of a person that continually adds these layers of blinding, that they don't take the time to poke their head up above the sand and look around at the relatedness of things. That's the unwise part of this. And the silliness is existing on this sort of superficial plane. The other reason that I brought up this idea of rest and leisure is that when I think about a silly person, there are a few different things that come to mind in my own experience. I think about myself, the way that I may behave sometimes, but also a close friend of mine who takes this silliness so far. And it's kind of hard at some times to get him to come out of that silliness, to get him to come out of the foolishness. And it almost becomes less of a way to reset, because I think humor can have that effect to it. But it also has this darker side to it, that silliness serves as the foolish blinder for which the individual hides in the superficial, hides within that disposition, such that the humorous, the removal of value or of attention from something is a defense mechanism almost, such that they don't necessarily have to deal with the difficult realities of things. And I think for some people, the difficult realities are just so blatant in front of us. Just experiencing without any external input. When I say external input, there's a buried sense, a graduated sense, because I don't necessarily mean the lack of input in general, like a sensory deprivation. We all always take in information as long as we are conscious. As I sit here now, I have no media playing in the background. It's just myself speaking into a microphone. And yet, I have all of these various stimuli in front of me. There's this light that is above the Bible. The Bible is propped up on a stand. I have this microphone and the computer that's recording. There are plenty of things that are going on in this situation. It's sort of a dynamic situation. But what I meant was that no external information. I've become so accustomed to devices that it would seem that this counterpart, this information engine that is the cell phone, that provides us with so many different apps for us to access information, this thing seems to be one of those sources of information almost that we can run to like an addict and consume as much as we wish and be satisfied while destroying our memory, making it harder and harder to form solid memories, but also harder to learn and retain information because of the sheer volume of it and the the way it's interacted with. And I say that to say, thinking about my friend and also of myself, sometimes I find that just sitting in silence can be difficult sometimes. The irony is that silence can be quite loud, and the loud part about it is the mind. Sometimes it's not even thoughts that create this loudness, just as it's not necessarily some purposeful thing in the world that causes our external environment to be noisy. It's not always the case that there's a lot of traffic and there's a lot of honking horns. It can just be the case that there is this static of experience and of existence, like on a television. It's just fuzz of things that don't make sense, and there's no attention to it, but yet it's almost it has a deafening quality to it. And I think that there is a very strong parallel between this and the foolish person. Not necessarily in the sense that the fool is like the static, not necessarily that the fool is like the busy intersection. I say a busy intersection because I live in an apartment that is on a busy street in one of the largest cities in the United States. And so, although I don't necessarily live in the city, I live just outside of it, but it's all the same at a certain proximity. And so I'm fairly aware of all of this commotion that can go on, especially at rush hour. There's so many people out. There's so many cars, and the sound is just continuous. But the foolish person does occupy this state of mind that is unable to surmount, unable to come out of the silliness, unable to use humor solely as a way to reset and to bring a situation that unfortunately affords us with contention to a place of production and growth. It is instead this place that buries us deeper into that drudgery, into the superficial morass of mental sluggery, of mental lethargy. A fool utters all his mind. And here, thinking about the mind and thinking about my experience with it, I've been trying to make a deal with myself lately. It shouldn't be as difficult, perhaps, as I make it seem, but I have a bad habit, I think, of consuming too much information from my devices. Now, I'm not on social media. I don't have Instagram. I don't have Facebook or any of that. I have YouTube, and that is the thing that I tend to focus on. I have so many different accounts that I'm subscribed to. Most of them are podcasts. Some of them are music. But despite being something that is productive, that provides me with useful information, sometimes I'll get into this mode, this habit of all the time wanting something to be playing, always satisfying that information engine. And I'm not doing anything productive, in a sense. And it's not the way the podcasting, the phone is not necessarily bad in and of itself. It is the way in which it is used. It is the way in which the mind wishes to participate with that information. A fool utters all his mind. I wonder exactly where to go from here, which road to take. Because I find within my experience some strong examples from adolescence all the way up until now, until adulthood, where the fool has occupied a much larger space of mind than he ought to. I think also culturally, especially after this latest election, especially after the campaign of RFK and his position now, his stance on health and his speeches on autism and the rise in the rates of autism. I think about the fool here too, in the autistic mind. I think about certain qualities that come to me when I think about both of these situations. Again, my experience, but also this cultural phenomena that we seem to be observing with the rise in the rates of autism. The word passivity comes to mind, but that's a beginning point. It's an entry point. I think of the word light, not light in the sense of like understanding or vision, but I think light in terms of weight. Superficial, I've mentioned a few times already. I think about that desire of mind to be satisfied. But the mind really only finding superficial things to satisfy it. And perhaps it is satisfied. It stays at a particular level. But all the while there is this small voice, the voice of reason, the antagonist to the fool, the wise man within all of us that says, you are meant for more. You are not meant for these childish experiences. What ought to satisfy you, what ought to drive the heart, is something that is meant for you to discover, facilitate the growth of that thing. Not to stay in this perpetual state, almost like adolescence, for which the mind is constantly looking for a relief in the way that perhaps a mother relieves a child of their hunger or their thirst. A fool utters all his mind. And perhaps just thinking in this way, I'm behaving foolishly. I'm certainly uttering all of my mind right now. I suppose this can exist at a few different levels. There are times that I've wondered about what I do as I sit here. Of course, it's unlikely that anybody is ever going to hear this. But all the same, a fool utters his mind. But a wise man keeps it in till afterwards. So when I originally read this verse, the first question that came to mind is, well, after what? A wise man keeps it in till afterwards. Now I think about, back to Genesis, I think about the process of creation. I think about how such a thing can be a model for all that we see, essentially. A creative process for all that we come to know and come to understand, all that we see. From the largest of scale to the smallest, to the most minute. And throughout all of this, I think about the way in which we can apply the first book of Genesis to our own thought process. That there is this coming to being, this consolidation of information, a hovering of consciousness and awareness over something that is without form, void, but eventually, even if the self is not necessarily thinking about anything in the moment, something will come to be. That void has consciousness there. Experience will fill the gap, almost like a negative pressure situation. And eventually thoughts will emerge. But here we are being advised not to necessarily divulge, to give in to those thoughts, and to express them, because not everything that is thought is worth saying. Not everything is thought is complete either. And in order to support some sort of coherence at this level, there needs to be a degree of completeness, that the creative process has to come through its full cycle. And I think the wise understand the importance of deliberation and reflection before something is put forth, before it is stated. And the foolish are unaware of this, or choose to deny it. If a ruler hearken to lies, all his servants are wicked. There's quite a similarity between this proverb and what we see in our current day, especially with the last presidency, where it was quite obvious where we had I suppose you can call him a ruler in the form of the president, an executive representative of the people. This ruler definitely listened to lies. And it is no surprise to Americans in the 21st century that their government has been overshadowed by a vast bureaucratic system. That bureaucratic system has usurped control and authority for themselves, some of which is wound up in a mindless apparatus of waste, some of which I think is quite deliberate. There are many fools that work to keep the lies moving, while the timeless bureaucrats, they continue their time in the government institutions while elected officials come and go. But there can be really no other option, no secret. Among a government that is meant to be occupied temporarily by citizens of that nation, if it is to be tied down, if it is to be this thing that ceases to identify the spirit of liberty, but rather uses the name of the spirit of liberty to tyrannize and to rule over the populace and blind the eyes of the people, that is surely, I think, wickedness. This wickedness involves that selfish desire to meet the ends of the self without consideration for anything outside. Now, there's another way in which this tyranny can come and find us. And I want to say that as much as this applies to our governing apparatus, it also applies to our own selves. I think that if we think top down, we think about the ruler listening not necessarily to his servant, but rather to anything. It could be a thought, a person outside of the governing apparatus, an ecclesiastical authority, whatever it might be. It is possible here that listening to lies, or finding something other than the truth, contrary to the truth, will pollute everything downstream. So this is when his servants become corrupt, because now they are the executors of an untruth. They serve the ruler who believes something that is false. And so here comes to mind a complaint, I suppose, something that I raise among my own thoughts often, that when I'm trying to find meaning in a particular situation, or even now when I'm trying to find meaning in a verse or meaning in a particular interaction, at times I find myself getting a bit anxious because of it, because I don't want to pause too long and to waste somebody's time, because what I seek to find is not of concern for most people, and I don't mean that in a hubristic sense, but rather I think probably most people can find it much easier. They can experience life a bit easier than I can. But again, I shouldn't make such judgments. It's hard to say exactly. But nonetheless, there's a way in which, as the mind finds itself more and more on the path of truth, I think it approaches that first principles thinking and consideration. But until that happens, until the mode of exploration and the desire for truth is had, there is this process of coming to, as I've mentioned in the previous verse, about the process of Genesis, for which the mind is always working. Even at night, there is this conscious experience, this awareness, even in the darkness. But there is this beginning of a new day in each new day of creation, for which something else happens. Some new creative process occurs, and information is consolidated in a different way. And I think about this process happening every time I, again, try to find meaning in something. And I think, right now at least, in terms of a conversation or some discussion, I had a few instances of that today, just sort of meta-thinking while I'm trying to manage a conversation. Not the most productive thing to do when you're trying to converse and have a genuine interaction, but it happened nonetheless. And I think that this is relevant to this verse. If a ruler hearkens to lies, all his servants are wicked. Is relevant because of the importance of the ruler to be able to think in a manner consistently, and not just on an intermittent basis like many of us, myself included. I think one of the qualities of a good leader is their resoluteness and their ability to orient their attention quite quickly, even if they are fatigued or if they don't feel like doing something. It is their duty to make the sacrifice of that painful maintenance of attention, let's say. And if the ruler is not able to find themselves in a place where they are not easily corrupted, and surely they will be corrupted, but a lie is something that is not insurmountable. It is something that has a mechanism to it. There's a way in which the truth can be found, and a lie that is expressed beneath the awareness of somebody is inevitable. It happens to all of us, but the general disposition towards truth, I think, is one of the great guardians against this type of corruption that we speak of here, or that the the author of this proverb speaks of. The poor and the deceitful man meet together. The Lord lightens both their eyes. Okay, so here's an interesting first section. We've spent a considerable amount of time talking about deceit and poor. Often when we discuss poor, it's in the context of lacking. And it's not just something that's attributed to material lacking. It's something much greater and much broader than that. When I think about wisdom, and I think about the mind just goes sometimes, and it's difficult to keep up with it. When I think about wisdom, I think about my experience relative to wisdom. I think about my conceptualization of the term, I suppose, that a wise person, although I don't pretend to be, I strive to move towards something approaching a state of wisdom, but I think as one is concerned more and more with that side of things, I think what becomes more and more clear is that one must be aware of many different categories of things, but not just categories of things. It is the relatedness between things. And while we have come to understand a vast amount about our experience and about the material world around us, and there are many people with a capacity of mind that is much greater than mine that can understand the interrelatedness of things in a way that surprises me, awes me, I guess, if I could say it that way, places me in awe. But given the conception that a wise person is concerned about the relatedness of things and the contextual significance among things, the lacking of such a thing means so much for the human experience. It means an absence of deep emotional connection, an inability to understand the self, but also the experience of another. I think the more deeply one understands themselves or the experience of self, the more somebody can understand the experience of somebody else. Of course, there must be a sophisticated process there so as one doesn't get trapped within the self, or the word within I sometimes have difficulties with, but trapped in a selfish mode of seeing reality, of experiencing things. The lacking, I think, is something that at least I experience on a personal level. Whenever I find myself disconnected, I find my mind disjointed, it's not focused. Perhaps there is a general uncomfortability of experience, and that causes the mind to continually wish to escape it, to find some release or relief, and not to have to be subjected to the hurdles and the trials of life. And I would say that this is certainly a type of lacking. Now, deceit, on the other hand, a type of a corruption of mind, a desire to mislead by one's own desire, is inherently a wicked pursuit. But it is not entirely unrelated to the concept of poverty. Of course, it can't be if we are to understand how these two men come to meet each other. So let's try and figure out how they meet each other on this road. I want to think a little bit more about the word deceit. When I think about deceit, I think about the word misrepresent, giving a false account of something. There does imply that the deceitful person is aware of the truth, but they distort it. But just because they are aware of the truth, I don't necessarily think that it makes them any better off than the impoverished person, because they are lacking in a certain way. They are using the truth more as a weapon or a tool to advance their own purposes, but perhaps more importantly to advance a purpose that is not for the sake of truth, but rather for the sake of some arbitrary desire. And here I think about many clauses in the Magna Carta that wished to, by civil authority, by the newly established prerogative of the civil authority or of the crown, that certain classes of men would be secured by law against certain abuses by the crown or by the civil authority in general. And it was by these preventions of arbitrary authority that the spirit of that liberty was secured. And if we think about just a singular man or two men in this situation, liberty means as much to them as it does to the collective. And liberation from a tyrant, a true tyrant, is a worthy liberation. And the spirit of liberty in that case is the spirit that we all know and love, our sort of standard American revolutionary tale about the righteousness of our cause and of our revolution. A man of lacking and a man of deceit, a man of wicked intent, both find themselves in a similar... I should be a bit careful. My mind goes in a few different places. The first place my mind goes is just the space for which the conscious mind inhabits. It inhabits something. And let's put aside the material substrate for a moment and just think a bit more broadly about experience and about awareness, about conscious experience, for which the simpler of things does not share in consciousness in the same way that we do. It is afforded a consciousness landscape, surely, but the agent that we perceive ourselves to be can compute this reality on a scale and a level that is different than the most basic forms of material stuff that we can consider or observe or measure. And it is by this experience, by this meta-reflection on the experience of awareness and of consciousness, that I think we are afforded this interesting space, that the mind exists in a turbulent, sometimes violent, sometimes seemingly meaningless structure. A structure that it can see, a structure that it can participate with, but also by virtue of its place, it is limited by what it can see, by what it can participate with. Interestingly, it can extend its reach and its sight, again giving it, I think, a unique quality. And again, by various experiences that he has had, he is afforded the ability to transcend himself into something of an agent of higher understanding. I think of the Christian experience here. And among all of these various nodes that we can identify as individuals that occupy this landscape, again, as I think about it, I don't think overly materially, but I don't deny the material causes of things. I think just the informational landscape. I think above and below, short and beyond our experience. And I think about the height of experience and of sight, the highest of which I can conceptualize might be God. And I think about the smallest of those, or maybe not the smallest, but I think about the aspects of human experience that are lacking, that are impoverished, that participate in the deceit. And here I suppose there's not much of a progression with this verse, but rather, now that we somewhat loosely occupy this image of the conscious landscape, I'm really concerned now with the deceitful person, the misrepresentation. How the separation of information, how the altering of information leads away from something important. Ironically, I think what it leads to the person that practices it, but also the person that is deceived, is somewhat of a commonplace, maybe at different levels, though, of different severity. Would a person that wishes to do good, wishes to liberate themselves from is falsehood? Would a person that wishes to do in order to maximize their selfish interest is to sacrifice truth for the sake of their own desire? And the sacrifice of such a thing leads to a lacking of truth. Because while they may understand the truth of a particular situation to misrepresent it, ultimately, in terms of the ends of that person, they are after something that is insular, that is restrictive in a way that is antagonistic to that transformation of mind. That transformation of mind that is that moves from a state of inattentiveness to greater attentiveness, from darkness to light, in the absolute sense of darkness to light. We all have darkness, the periods of darkness of the mind and periods of light of the mind. Necessarily so. It's built into our physical makeup. We must lay our head down to rest. We must go through a period of darkness in terms of conscious experience, but also a period of wakefulness. And as much as that darkness of conscious experience can find ourselves in a state of unconsciousness when we are sleeping, it can find us during states of absolute awareness. when we are awake, rather, I should say. It probably applies more so there than it does when we are sleeping, because that's such a state of lacking of conscious experience that it's almost not worth mentioning, at least in this context. So the deceitful person, I've said, is lacking because they sacrifice a greater truth for the sake of themselves. They wish to understand smaller truths so that only that they can distort them, distort the landscape that's in front of them. But they don't care much for the broader landscape. Maybe they do insofar as they can use it to control and to cast a net over another person's conceptual or conscious space and sphere. But that predatory experience, like I've said, is insular. It crashes in on itself. And then it fundamentally, where it began to reach out so that it can take advantage, it sucks back into itself like a void. The poor and the deceitful man meet together. The Lord lightens both of their eyes. Much like the spirit of liberty, the spirit of goodness, as it flows through all things, as it flows through all individuals, all human beings. It is something that can be felt. It is something that can direct our mind. It is something that cannot be denied. It is something of an orienter that reminds us where to place our attention. And here I pause the mystical thought for a moment, and I have this hunger for something that is practical. So what does this mean for us practically? What does this mean for us experientially? Perhaps a road that we can go down here is, how does this meet within us, but how do we find this out in our environment, interacting with people? So today happens to be a new day, new thoughts. And I'll open this up with a prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you that I can be here today. I thank you that I can take this time to reflect. I thank you that I thank you for awareness. I thank you for the testing today. I thank you that although my composure was tested, or my behavior was tested, that I upheld a degree of stability, although I know that I must improve quite a bit still. I know that I must be energized when necessary in the face of such testing, and not to shy away from it, or not to give in to the lowest common denominator, but rather to take the high road, to solve a problem as it ought to be solved, not to leave aspects of it undone. And as I submit now my failures, and I recognize that even though that I may have presence of mind, especially of late, I know that there are areas that I need to work on. There are problems that I have left unsolved, untreated. And as a man, as a person who wishes to be of faith and of good standing, these are the types of loose ends that I must tie down and get squared away. So Lord, with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. The poor and the deceitful man meet together. The Lord lightens both their eyes. So yesterday I was talking about how to use this in a practical example. And I've been trying my best not to get too lost in the mind, not to abstract things too far. I try at times to bring it back to my own experience, how I feel about things, how I observe things. And part of the reason I think that this is important is because the practical nature, practical reflections, prevent against that possibility for a certain type of consequence when it comes to abstraction or intellect, in which forming thoughts that are practical in the moment almost become difficult, I found. Ironically enough, the more that one spends in that sort of abstract intellectual sphere, the harder it is at times to actually communicate with people. And I don't say that out of some thought or idea that I am somehow intellectually superior. I just think that literally the space of mind for which we exercise that abstract intellect can cause us to dissociate. And it has nothing really to do with the rightness or wrongness of our reflections. I could be completely wrong in everything that I say. And yet I still find myself in that domain. And within that domain, spending too much time can be counterproductive. So, I say that to say that we are going to be exploring some practical examples here. There probably will be some abstraction, but I'll try my best to keep it grounded. The poor and the deceitful man meet together. So where I go is personal experience. I think about looking through this subjective lens that I have. And in that prayer that I introduced this day with, I think there is something in there, especially something that happened today. It usually happens all days. And I've been becoming more and more aware of these events as they happen. Now forgive my ADHD here, but the spiritual domain is complex. It is fascinating. In some sense, the spirits flow through us. They form the fabric of our meaningful experience. We can call the poor man or the deceitful man a type of spirit. I've been studying the Magna Carta recently or lately, and the spirit of liberty is quite an obvious trope. It is quite an obvious spiritual phenomena, where certain situations, relations among peoples, orientations and structures of institutions, all of these sorts of things, given a period, given a series of events, will allow us to see that spirit more clearly and be able to define it and identify it. And then in a strange way, it can almost in an instant find itself absent from the landscape, and we can no longer see it. We can no longer feel it. We no longer experience it. Now, thinking about the practical experience, as there are many ways that this can be possibly taken, I'm thinking about deceit, and I'm thinking about lacking, or the poor man in my mind, in my experience today. And I'm thinking how they have met. There's one experience in particular. I think I maintained my composure, but I know that my feelings and my thoughts were completely betrayed what I had to say. Or rather, maybe a more accurate way to put that is that my feelings did not match my expression. And so in that there's a bit of deceit. Necessarily so. And I think also within the very process of coming to this lie of not conveying the feelings that were beneath, or allowing the feelings to form into this antagonistic expression of negative emotion that surrounds the in this case I was talking to an individual, surrounds that person, and it forms all of these negative ideas about them. They are this way, they do this when they should not. It's a very controlling type of mindset. It comes from a place of wanting things to be straightforward and simple. But sometimes this laziness or haste to be in a certain posture of ease is not what is presented in front of us. Rather, sometimes there are delicate situations that are not solved through passivity and through want of leisure. At times, difficult situations require difficult and intricate communication. Sometimes there needs to be a significant sacrifice on the part of the individual, on the part of myself, so that my ego does not take over, and does not command a certain disposition that of course will be sensed, felt by the person that I'm interacting with, at some level at least. Now, I want to speak a little bit more about deceit, how it has found itself within this example. Again, the formal definition: the action or practice of deceiving someone by concealing or misrepresenting the truth. Now, there's a certain way in which some may identify my description of deceit here as partial, that it's not true deceit. But I wish to submit that I think that there are levels to this type of behavior. And if we are truly to move above and beyond it, we have to identify its most subtle forms. And while I didn't necessarily say anything to this person to cause him to do something for my own, well, I didn't say anything that was false professionally. I didn't misrepresent the truth so that he would do something for my own selfish gain, I suppose, to a degree. There's a way in which I can reverse that and say that there was a way in which I misrepresented the truth for my own personal gain. But the way in which the subtlety of deceit, I think, had found me in that moment was that when I was feeling this irritability, regardless of what it was born of, it was my problem that I let this get to the place it had gotten to. I let the negative emotions fill me. And the thing about the base negative emotions is that they desire reason. They desire some logic to attach themselves to. And what they found was a certain type of egoism that failed to identify the mistakes of the self, and instead they chose to latch on to every reason that was outside of individual guilt. The negative emotions were then attributed to qualities of the person that were in front of me. That my efforts were subdued by the inherent deficits in the character of the person in front of me. And the truth of the claim really isn't the matter. What is the matter, I think, is, in some sense, the disposition. That the negative emotion was formed of a reflection, perhaps, of poor communication, but moreover than that, a reflection about about the way in which I felt that this person would respond or would react to my explanation or my reasoning without much regard. And because of this lack of regard, it gave me full license to assault this person's character in my head. And since there was this disconnect, there was this concealment of the truth, I think there was deceit. And the way that this finds the poor man is, I think that the poor man is a bit more fundamental than deceit. Deceit follows, at least in this scenario. The poor man was born at the point of lacking, at the point where myself, the willful agent, failed to produce reason to satisfy these emotions that were building up. And the emotions were building up because of a persistent... Now, there is a two-way street, so I have to identify here that the person that I was communicating with was quite communicative, difficult to stop, to interrupt, and to explain something in detail. Also a bit resistant, I would say, to information. And so there's a heavy outpouring of information from the individual and a very small inflow of information. And so because of this discrepancy, because of my inability to address the information flow and the connectedness between us, it had led to this resentment that I wanted to just push the individual away, that they were not worthy, that they were worthless. And this is not a good place to find oneself. It's actually the opposite. It is more of that lacking. It is creating a greater divide, a greater destruction in that infrastructure of information, of outgoing and inflowing information. And so in this situation, the poor man had found deceit just by those varying degrees of separation and by the perpetuation of that negative emotion and the unfortunate reasons that the emotions had found an attachment to. Now, in this situation, being again thankful for the ability to reflect, thankful for the prayer, the second part of this verse now becomes more apparent. When I feel now that I've explored it and I can see it, I understand a little bit more about what it means by the Lord lights up both of their eyes. Because now I can see that if I find myself back in this scenario or situation, if I can find enough confidence, or rather, maybe not confidence, but courage, not necessarily to pause and to directly address information flow. That wouldn't really make any sense. It wouldn't be practical. But rather to begin to steer the ship in such a way that a new orientation would maximize the outflow and inflow of information between both parties. Then that would have been best. The king that faithfully judges the poor, his throne shall be established forever. So what can be made of this? Part of me thinks that at times it's difficult to understand this type of language because we don't live in a monarchy. We don't live in that type of political society. But another part of me says that it doesn't really matter. We can do our best to put ourselves in the context, in that specific situation, how that might manifest in a society like that. Take from it the spirit, certainly an approach that I use to interpret the Magna Carta, for example. But there's also another way, I think, that we can think about this. Among the various divots and pits that are formed in our conscious society, let's say, and these pits and divots, I wouldn't give them a negative attribution per se, but I say that they're pits and divots in the sense that the farther the depth is into this conscious society, the more consciousness there is, perhaps. I don't quite like that distinction. The more agency is another word, but it's not quite right. Well, certainly we can come to, if I have some meaning at all, we can come to it. So thinking again, if we had to trace this down to a principle that has some value to it, we imagine this conscious society. By that I mean, if we take all of mankind, or we could take one particular society, if we wish. We can identify the United States. We could take any scale. It doesn't have to be the scale of the United States, it could be the scale of the family. But we take the United States, we take all of this, of the many people that contribute to this conscious landscape. Out of this landscape, we have all of our institutions. we have our religious sensibilities, our religious toolkit, our psychotechnologies. We go about our days, we produce things that we feel to be meaningful. We participate in ways that we feel to be meaningful. Each and every one of us has this impact to the larger experience, however small or large it might be. Some of us have much larger impacts than others. It's sort of like a crater. I see this impact, this sort of divot or depth of influence. Now, I think influence is approaching the correct meaning here. Just like an agent has, it is assumed that the agent has some degree of influence. What this conscious landscape rests upon is a broader information substructure. Of that information substructure, we find material things, and we find things of mind. Operating on that system of material causes, no doubt, but nonetheless, we have all of this information articulating, transmitting, exchanging. And again, in the particular context, in the conscious society, we find pockets of meaning, pockets of an agentic quality that have some ability to execute a goal. They have their desires. The amount of information that can be exchanged, I think, has a role to play in the depth of each individual's swell of conscious experience in this landscape. Influence in this way, I think we can attribute this sort of information flow to. In any number of societies, we can find a leadership class, whether it be corporate, civil, ecclesiastical, and among all of these leaders in their various domains, we find that depth of experience and of potential for the exchange of information. I think about Elon Musk, the wealth that he has created, the amount of influence that he has, but also that ability to move in productive ways across society. A deep swell. We can think about a king in the same manner. A very deep swell. And within these situations, within these individuals or groups of individuals, however we choose to classify it, I think we can observe, we can identify the effects that a particular thought or judgment, in the case of this verse, might have on the rest of the nodes in that network. And thinking about the mechanics that exist within each one of these depressions or swells, filled to the brim with this ready and available information to be exchanged. If we think about the word judgment or judge, and again thinking about the mechanics, beginning with the etymological consideration here. The etymology of the word judge comes from the Latin, meaning one who declares the law, one who decides a legal case. From the Old Greek, we have a word that means judge, arbiter, related to the word krino, meaning to separate, decide, judge. There is a sense of discernment, separation between right and wrong. But I want to focus on this Greek meaning, to separate and to decide. It may seem at first instance to be trivial, but judgment fundamentally involves this separation of things. It involves seeing the various pieces and elements. The question of how to exert such profound influence, to have this outpouring of the swell of information that is just pooled there in that great potential, like waters that is held back by a dam that can be opened volitionally by the dam operator. It takes great wisdom and prudence, I think, for a person in this type of position, or any person in general, that when they release whatever store of that information that they have, whatever degree of agency that they have, that what flows from them is good and right. And to be a judge, I think, a faithful judge, is certainly to have the good in mind, but there's an undeniable aspect of discipline involved in there. So if we take this specific example, the king that faithfully judges the poor. Now, in the previous verses, we have discussed the nature of the impoverished person as somebody that is not just lacking in material prosperity, although that can be quite a significant element. But generally, a poor person is a person of lacking. All of us go through situations of lacking throughout our day, perhaps throughout the years and throughout our lives, through different periods of our lives. It comes in many forms. By these possibilities, I think, what can be caused, at least in terms of the observation of the person that is lacking, is a creature of disdain. A creature of a feeling of superiority. A dehumanization of the lacking. But of course the judge, he holds a special position. Doesn't mean he'll do right, but he holds a special position. And because he holds this special position, he has a particular type of responsibility. This responsibility affords him certain insights. And his daily decisions, I think, are often, if he chooses to listen, are often fraught with difficulties of life, of living, of being. But when he does find himself in such a state or such a disposition to be a caring person, to be an attentive person, then his judgment becomes all the more important. His effective decisions build on one another and create something beautiful. And just as much as we can reflect on this experience of lacking, and from the standpoint of the king, if he is unjust, to look at the people beneath the burden of that lacking with disdain, we can just as easily think about the converse, at which a king looks at a person, and while I think in most cases, especially since I had mentioned that lacking is in all of us at all times to various degrees, and that lacking isn't always something that can be or even be quite severe when a person is huddled up in an alleyway with a light blanket curled over them. Such a state of destitution is exceedingly rare these days, and I don't mean to say that it is not a problem, because it is. But I say this to say that, especially when we are considering a king that faithfully judges, there are many people of a character that will identify a person that is homeless, as I've mentioned in the previous image, and say that that is wrong. But it is much harder to find that aspect of mind that is curled up within somebody that somewhat represents this homeless person. Perhaps for them it doesn't manifest in drug addiction, in obvious lethargy, and what drives them there is multifactorial. But instead, with the lacking of within mind, or of mind, brings a poisonous node in the network. And I suppose we can say at some level, a homeless person and a significant population of homeless people becomes burdensome to society. The behavior certainly does. But by degrees, I think we can imagine how we can move away from the extreme, the standard image of a person that is impoverished or lacking. And I think what we find is a spirit of lacking. It is something that penetrates all things. It is something that in and of itself isn't necessarily bad. It's not necessarily good. But it is something that is a constant of nature. Of material things that are non-biological, and I think also of things that are biological. For in the simplest sense, of matter that is non-organic, that's non-living, we can say that there are attractions among elements. Attractions by forces that are also fundamental, that repel but also can draw things into it. And we could say by that attractiveness that there is a degree of wanting there, that there is this pull, a pull that in that particular instance, in that particular snapshot, does not really mean all that much, especially when we consider it with our lives. In the broader scheme of things, the interrelatedness among things, I think, provides us with a lot of value, even finding its way down to that small snapshot that I had mentioned. And I think that there are many of these things that we can call spirits that leave their evidence throughout so many different domains of life. And if they are indeed a phenomena of conscious experience, that if they don't, well, surely they do have a grounding in reality. They manifest in bizarre and interesting ways. And they manifest on such a strange level of reality that requires all of this material, at least seemingly on the surface, senseless information that is so dispersed, that comes together so concentrated at one point, that it makes one wonder that the pointedness of that thing, how can such a thing be so lonely? How can such a thing be so disconnected from such an important experience, that of life and that of consciousness and self-awareness? But of course, this is the point of view of one small individual that is in that experience, that of what he knows, that of what his contemporaries know, that he is this small speck in so much unexplored territory that is reality. And in that conscious domain, that flickering of light when material organizes in such a way to afford a different type of experience, man finds himself on the cusp of really appreciating what is on the other side of that mental threshold. And for all the talk that there is about the potential negatives that may come from our artificial intelligence future, and of our potential to merge with machines and all this sort of thing, it's impossible to predict the future. We will have our struggles along the way. Certain dilemmas will have to be solved. Certain mistakes will be made. But when all of our opinions are dead and gone, and things change, life changes, there will be this experience that is left. Hopefully a much more matured experience. Our religion will advance, no doubt. We will see higher things. We will see more of these spirits that I mentioned. So forgive me, but today is a new day. It happens to be the evening, and I'm starting to get a little tired, but not tired enough to abandon a creative pursuit. So I like to start this with a prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you that I can be here today. I thank you that I am sitting in this chair, and I have pulled away from the day-to-day and all of the preset habits that I have, preset behaviors perhaps, pushing off deeper emotions until a time that is not present. It is for that holy time, sacred time. But I wish more strongly, the more that I come to know you, to find this sacred sense of being or presence to be all throughout me, not to be corrupted, not to be prone to all of the silliness that the mind of myself can conjure up. And I'm thankful that now, as I speak into the microphone, that here is an opportunity to tie up, to shore up some of these loose ends, and to incarcerate those habitual offenders in my mind, and to release them from my experience. With this, in Jesus' name I pray, amen. Now I'm trying at my best to piece together exactly what I was talking about yesterday. I have a vague memory of it, but there was a theme that I can remember. And speaking about the spirits, speaking about some of these fundamental spirits that just flow through all of us. While we may identify it more strongly, closer to the principal identity of the self, somebody can be more cowardly, somebody can be cowardly. When we move all of these potential states of being into their extreme, we find their home, we find that spirit. And I think it is those spirits that I'm attempting to consider. Well, we are considering that the king that faithfully judges the poor, his throne shall be established forever. We've been speaking about faithfully judging, I think, for some time. So what then? The spiritual life. The life built upon life. The life of the human mind, dancing around in this broad display as if each one of us was a projector onto this back post or screen of what we call reality of the material world. And the projections, and even in finer detail with each individual, every individual person, and the variability that is within us. All of this is shown. And I think because all of this is shown, or seen rather, but not just because it is shown and it is seen, that then we must obey because we don't want anybody finding out our sinful nature, but because we understand that we are born of a much larger process that has goodness in mind. And this experience, the responsibility that we are given to project awareness, consciousness into the material space. We have a moral responsibility to make sure that what is shown against the screen to be good, to be decent. And it is by the fear of not doing this that does to a degree involve the observer beyond us, but also because what we love is awareness, and what we love is consciousness, and what we wish to expand is goodness, then it is just goodness as our primary concern. So the king that faithfully judges the poor. It's about the in-between. It's about the details of man and of the intricacies of his mind. To judge the poor is not a straightforward matter. It can be made so in the mind, I think, at the expense of the complete truth. And of each and every lacking, there is a process of coming to. There is a procedure, a road that must be taken in order to surrender or either to accept. Surrender the lacking and the longing, in a sense. I suppose I should dwell here for a moment, because the idea of surrendering the lacking almost seems impossible. But I think at times, especially in cases of denial or of difficult manage, the lacking may not be perceived as something that is given up. And in fact, as I think about it now, I think it's a rather strange way to think about it. But I believe that there is some sense to it. Again, in the case of difficult management or of denial, that somebody is fundamentally lacking something. It's hard to give it up if one doesn't know that it is there, or that they have buried it so deep that what they see at the surface, the effects that are from some more central cause, are so distal to that primary mechanism that they have all but forgotten that it exists. And such a terrible experience it is to come to some understanding, given a number of years, perhaps in a particular relationship, after strong commitments have been made on both sides, that there's something deeply lacking or unsatisfying about that experience. And throughout the years of dishonesty, coming to a place of honesty is difficult, and that transformation, I think, is a very vulnerable period. Transformation in the sense that, of this particular example of a relationship, that it can enter into a positive spin or a negative spin and spiral downward and to disunity. But if we stick with the example for a moment of a dysfunctional relationship, if we had to ask ourselves, well, what is being sacrificed? If we are lacking something, then surely we have nothing to give because it is something that we need. That is our sort of definition of this lacking. It's something that we don't have. So how can we give this thing that we are desperately desiring? Well, there's the difference between the state of lacking and then that which one does not have. And I think what I mean by sacrificing the lacking is to sacrifice that state of lacking. And while it may not be possible from a psychological standpoint or a mechanical standpoint to do it immediately, there are ways in which we can plan. We can make goals, and we can slowly begin to turn that ship around and turn the lacking into something that is not burdensome. We can fix the relationship, we can get out of a relationship, we can do any number of things. And so I think that there is a state of mind that accompanies lacking. This awareness of the withoutness. And that if it is overly centralized in the mind, overly centralized with regard to our attention, I think it is likely the case that we become a victim of ourselves. We say of justice that we have been wronged, that our state of lacking is unjust, and that we must be given something, that we are owed something. And from a cultural standpoint, this has gotten to such a pathological, psychopathological stage that this contagion has spread across many facets of our society. And there are days that I find it within myself, and I think to myself that this lacking that you experience, whatever it might be, is not some force that is oppressing you. It is a call indicating to you that you should do something about this uncomfortable state if you wish to improve it. The true injustice is not doing anything about it. We are sort of judging ourselves in that broad scheme. The king that faithfully judges the poor. Judgment of this lacking, as I've said before, I think is a delicate procedure. And somebody who can do this, not just on the individual level, but also on a group level or on an institutional level, one can see quite readily how this faithful judge that says of this lacking where is it? How do we sacrifice it? How do we institute this transformation of mind such that it is truly not a burden, but a call for something greater? The degree that a king is able to do this is the degree to which his society will prosper. His throne shall be established forever. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings his mother to shame. So this is an interesting verse. There's some related experience that I have here that I think might be useful for my own growth and for understanding why this might be true. So beginning with the first half, the rod and reproof give wisdom. So I wonder, of course, the first thing that I think about is discipline. When I think of the rod, I think of some punishment for some offense. Reproof, I think more of a psychological indication of why something that was done wrong is actually wrong. And again, that rod is that somatic, visceral discipline, like a physical restraint, a physical blow, whatever it might be. But I want to speak a little bit more about this reproof and the rod. Probably not as much about the rod as the reproof, but we'll see when we get there. I want to start with the word reproof. Now, I was looking again at the etymological chain associated with this word, and in the Latin, if we take the prefix re, it means again or back, and then probare, meaning to test, approve, or prove. Now, this got me thinking about something that it might be productive here. The question is, we could take any old scenario. We can take an unfortunate situation at work which causes us to be reproved, and the negative experience that implies. We could think about a child that is reproved for their behavior. Now, on the surface, it's quite easy to understand it's quite easy to understand why this is done. If a child, for example, is misbehaving, what we wish to do is to correct the misbehavior so he doesn't or she doesn't do that again. And given all of these small corrections, later in life the child will not have to run up against major roadblocks, perhaps even dangerous roadblocks to their behavior, and learn it either through law enforcement or through a very difficult time, state of destitution. But on a deeper level, I do find that there is an interesting set of mechanics I think that we can reflect on. And going back to the Latin, when I think about returning to something, there's an idea of repetition in the prefix, but also a returning. And I think both are somewhat accurate if we think about if some behavior is contrary to something, then we have to go back a little ways in order to not only to see the behavior that has happened, but also to see the cause of it. If we're talking about true reproof, now we can have, in the corporate sense that I had brought up, illustrated, we can imagine that this situation, the reproof that we find here, is not all that deep, but it may be with the threat of our unemployment. And this is more of the rod, the immediate correction. That while this is something that I value very highly, the threat of this is something that I cannot bear, so I will submit. Now, I may be unfair to the symbol of the rod, but again, we'll get there in time. But back to the word reproof. And back to that consideration that we are looking back at something. We are reflecting back at something. Now, if there's a reproof, there's likely two parties involved, but an honest person can reprove themselves, I think, quite efficiently, accurately. But in order to do this, one must look back at the behavior, and depending how far back, how personal this is, it can be traced quite far back into our ontological roots, perhaps. I want to give one story here that I think serves as a reminder for all of us who wish to be heavily self-reflective, who wish to adhere to the right thing, to be reminded that it is possible that we can go overboard, that in our fear for poor judgment or of transgressing some law, we can torture ourselves with that. And it need not be that way. We should still exercise prudence, but also give ourselves grace. It is this balance that's important. And the story that I have, I think, highlights that. When I was in graduate school, I was living with two roommates. One of my roommates, I had a difficult time getting along with him. But there was one time that he raised an interesting point about a friend, a mutual friend, a mutual student, a fellow student of ours, that he had some disagreement with this person. There was some conflict. And what he did was that he wished to understand him in order to approach the conflict. And he brought up the fact that this person, this mutual friend of ours, had a sister. He was an older brother, I think, in that family. At the time, my other roommate thought he was rather strange for starting there. But I understood where he was going. I think the manner in which he approached it, the context, everything about that, and reasoning through it was a little off, and it skewed it and made it a little uncomfortable when he brought it up. But his point was that he was trying to understand how he was raised, the position in the family, all that sort of thing, and trying to understand how he should approach him from that angle. While there is some reason to that, I find it difficult to understand why anybody would start there. And I bring this small story up because when we are thinking about reproof and we are thinking about going back into the roots of our presence, of our being, we have to be very careful, and we have to follow things quite sequentially so that we don't mess it up. It's like a very delicate math equation with many different variables. One small rounding error will give us a massively incorrect answer. And just as if my roommate in this case, as he was searching for a cause for the way that my friend is, in a superficial manner, or in a manner that is incomplete, or in a way that is unproductive, and that if he understood the family dynamics, he may be able to approach him in a certain way, but there are too many other things, there are so many different things that are irrelevant that that situation and that approach probably would not have been the most appropriate. But despite that, despite the possibility of tracing something to fundamental causes, providing us with incorrect downstream observations, it is not to say that what is upstream is false, because of course there are things that occur upstream that affect everything downstream. But it's a matter of the size and the effect and the relevance. So today happens to be a new day, and like usual, a new day, new thoughts. And so I'll open this with prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you that I can be here today. I thank you once again that I return to this moment, that I can come back to a sacred place and to share something on a level that I value, that I desire, I hunger for. I was thinking about this moment today. I was thinking about all of the different interactions and experiences that I had today. How would these events play out in a prayer? Would I be addressing them? Is there something that I have failed to see or failed to live up to that later on, when I reflect on it, I will have to come to some conclusion, and to not necessarily force honesty, but by honesty come to the right conclusion, to adjust my behavior in such a circumstance and situation. And of the overarching theme, I think, that I had thought at the time, I came to the conclusion that in periods of abject suffering is not the right word, but adverse feelings, let's say negative emotion, a theme that constantly, or not constantly, but commonly is expelled from my mouth. I felt at the moment myself thinking about my thinking. For this I will say thank you, for without you I would not be able to see this level of myself. And so this looking down, despite the feeling, I think was one of the things that caused me to not dwell or be captured by those feelings. It is this possibility of the mind that we are given, and the background that we participate in. And although there's still much work to be done here about finding my way out of such situations, I'm nonetheless thankful that I had this experience today. Much like in a previous prayer, I had mentioned a situation about walking down the hallway in the morning and feeling something similar, but during the length of that hallway, there was quite the strong attempt to recognize those feelings and to put in explicit steps to change them and to do what is right. And so with this, I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So the question is, well, where do we begin now? How do we pick up where we left off? So I just finished telling that strange story about my roommate in college that had wished to connect with another friend of mine on an intimate level so that they could solve a problem. And of this situation, there were things about it that I found admirable. Admirable perhaps to the extent that my other friend, my other roommate, did not necessarily understand or see. That the environment affords us a lot if we are able to come to common ground. Mutual affordances are the gateway, the infrastructure for which we can trust one another and exchange that information. But then there's the other element of this, for which, even in the attempt, there is much difficulty. If we try to go too deeply to some principle that we don't understand how it's related to a downstream cause, that we may do the converse. We may establish an environment that is counterproductive. And that, in sort of contemporary language, it would seem strange, weird. It would make it uncomfortable for a person to approach a topic with the primary intention being that this person has a sister, he is at this in this position in the familial hierarchy, so I'm going to approach him this way. And of course, it would be quite blunt if I know my former roommate well, and I know that it would not have worked. The rod and reproof give wisdom. And from what I also remember, we were speaking about the word reproof, focusing specifically on the Latin root of coming back to something. The idea of coming back to something to test it, or to prove something. And I think what led us here was my roommate had wanted to find some proof, but his way to finding that proof was inefficient at actually doing it. Now, the conversation didn't actually end up happening, I don't think, but it would have been an interesting one to hear if I was a fly on the wall. So with this in mind, all that is to say that given a reproof, we can be mistaken, that there is potential for good intention, but to have a negative result. So leaving that aside, I want to focus on a little bit more detail about the rootedness of what this means. Now, true reproof. Here's another example that I want to speak about. Over the weekend, it happens to be a Monday today, so yesterday this happened, I had a conversation with a friend that's a bit older than I am, who's has very contrary views towards religion and even religious practice, certainly religious institutions. There is an understanding to a degree on her part about the usefulness of religion, and she herself has admitted that she does believe in God. But there is so much anger, mistrust for perceived wrongs, historical wrongs, that her compassion compels her to essentially hatred. And it compels her to this lack of the desire or lack of ability to see a positive definition or positive definitions for particular terms. One of them happens to be religion. And I found myself thinking, aside from that I probably didn't handle the conversation as well as I could have, that the word religion in the minds of many has an entirely negative connotation to it. And that whatever productive, positive meaning that can be attributed to such a large word, this has died. What was has ceased to be. And it's not as though a positive definition does not exist, or that there is a way of understanding faith and religion in a productive manner. I think that there is. And I think there is, even to the degree that this person would understand. But I bring this up because I think about this in a similar way when I see the word reproof. But I think about it not in terms of what others may think, but about my preconceived ideas about the word reproof. And that this exercise for me is almost it is an experience of rediscovering and redefining, defining in a positive manner. Not that I had a particularly negative idea of the word reproof, but my definition of the word reproof was not very expansive. And so with this in mind, we should dive deeper. Again with the Latin, returning to something, coming back to something, the wish and the desire to prove something. When I think about reproof, I think about just thinking about one person, thinking about an individual, and now expressing through one individual, in terms of myself, I speak the following. I've committed some wrong, or I have a feeling that I've committed some wrong. There's an aspect of me that I wish to exercise to make him stronger. He is the judge. He is the internal face. And as I give to trusting this internal face, and I don't wish to ascribe too much to the word internal, but it's a useful marker for this point, the internal face. The internal face allows for this reproof. Now this is not, or my conceptualization of this is just a narrative through which I can get my point across. I don't necessarily mean to suggest that the internal face is a constant part of man's experience. Perhaps it is, but it's a useful way of conceptualizing. And who knows if I'll return to it or not. But the internal face is responsible and capable of this term, reproof. And so in light of what I've said in the prayer and everything else about my experiences with negative emotion and not letting these negative emotions get expressed and find themselves out in the world plaguing the minds of other people, whether it be because of a sly remark or because of a betrayal in my facial expression Betrayal may not be the right word, but a betrayal in the sense of the internal face, the good judge, let's say. Not a betrayal in the sense of that is how I actually feel, because that is how I feel. It is truthful. But nonetheless, when I'm out in the world and I'm experiencing and I'm sharing, honest reproof, I think, in the moment is difficult. It is something that requires a sudden honesty, a sudden reset amid the torrent of potential thought, the white noise of mind and of experience. And of that negative emotion, which is truly destructive to attention. So this honesty may serve as the beginning of reproof. That in order to find ourselves in a particular place, the only key that will allow us in that environment is honesty. Again, we're talking about true reproof. There's an aspect of reproof, more of a superficial aspect of reproof, for which one is rebuked, that they are disciplined. And that although this will follow certain fundamental important qualities of the reproof, of setting something right, I think it can often lack the transformability of that experience, or the potential that any particular experience provides. And so, reproof, I find myself thinking almost like I'm at a starting line. But where is this starting line exactly? It's not starting thinking about reproof. It's starting a chain of reasoning. Again, going back to the Latin, there's the idea of returning to something, returning to a fundamental place, again, for which honesty, I think, is the map, or it is the key to open that door. The map is kind of interesting to think about, because if we're driving in a car, we need to know how to get to a first principle. We have a map to get there. And the map is honesty. And so let's say we take the word probare, to test, approve, or to prove. We take this testing. The test is the thing by which we can hold up our thoughts, our desires, and the outcome is the thing that will tell us whether or not we are mistaken or true. Now, in here lies much potential for confusion. This is why I think the sort of strict, lawful approach, the admonition, the rebuke, the sudden correction is so useful. Because a law that is strong and firm will hold by its own reasoning, by its own logic. And sometimes an established law, it takes too many tests, retests, to confirm its truth. And people test it in many different ways until they discover, by the detriment to much of their efforts, and perhaps even sacrifices on a large scale, that they were mistaken, and that a law is true and ought to stand firm. Now, this doesn't tell us much about how to determine the truthfulness of a law. But it does, at the very least, I think, afford us an idea that there is some truth to be had, that there is a rightness to it, and that we ought not to get lost within the self. So again, honesty. There is a surrendering of self in that process of reproof. And since I mentioned that we are talking about the self in this situation, it has to be this way. There has to be a surrendering of one's firmly held belief and their desire for a moment so that they can honestly test something. So today happens to be a new day again. A new day, new thoughts. I'm determined today to finish this verse that we've been on. But I like to begin with a prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. The beginning of this week, it is a Tuesday today. The beginning of this week has been quite busy. I found my mind to be quite occupied with work. There's an element of that for which I'm thankful, and there's an element of that for which I am lacking in my spiritual obligations. And I know that there has been time for which I have taken an hour to do nothing. And although the mind benefits to a degree from this absence, I wish at this moment to find the strength to use those hours in a productive manner. And at this moment I wish to really focus my attention on goodness and not get lost in the minutia, focus on the important aspects of things, to see a larger picture. And with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So what we were steadily approaching, given that last bit of recording, was something of a scientific method, but more in a subjective frame. That there is this method by which we can follow from an individualistic standpoint that will help us support our claims, come to accurate conclusions, provide us with principles, supports for those judgments. And the interesting thing about these supports for these judgments is that we can't altogether say that they're objective. We could say that they are of the subject. Now, subjective has a negative connotation these days to it, as if the information that comes from the subject is just inherently wrong or polluted. And of course there are situations in which information that comes from the subject can cause us to have a distorted distorted vision of reality, of physical reality or otherwise. But there must be, just as there is in coming to understanding things about the material world that are true, and blocking our potential, not necessarily propensity, but just potential in general for deception, self-deception, willingly or without awareness, doesn't matter. This subjective frame, the idea of coming to understand something from the intuitive side of life, must be a powerful aspect of our experience, and an aspect of our experience that we continue to grow and to learn from. The rod and reproof give wisdom. So we've come to this point now, speaking about the Latin root for reproof, of returning to a place for which we wish to test ourselves again, so that we can prove the rightness or wrongness of our beliefs. And this has to do with our subjective beliefs. This has to do with our morals. This has to do with our faith. And it is something that should always be tested. It is always something that should be tried. And I think that within the testing, the repeated testing, and the repeated observation, the road that we are led to is wisdom. Of course, we are prompted to consider that the road we are led to is wisdom. And the question is how exactly. Wisdom must necessarily be this thing, this way of seeing, such that the concern is for the relatedness of things, the way in which things articulate. The way in which good things can be propagated through the various articulations. And of these articulations, we can speak of a person to a person. We can think of an institution to a person, or an institution to an institution, a state to an individual, etc., wherever we want to find ourselves thinking about it. So before we move on to the rod, I want to give one example, because without an example, I don't think we can complete this reflection. So I'll take an example from today. So as I search my mind, general themes begin to pop up. What comes to mind is inattentiveness, but a particular type of inattentiveness that leads to, this is quite particular, but it leads to a hesitation in expression, a hesitation in expressing my thoughts, and it might manifest in slurring my words, which I even do on this podcast. It might be in a stutter. That, of course, doesn't happen all the time, but every once in a while it does, and at times when this does happen, it's because of this poorly allocated attention. And as I think about it, as I think about the reproof for this situation, when I return to that fundamental, the origin point of why it was caused, I suppose I can identify that there is an awareness that this is happening. The question is, well, if there's an awareness of why it is happening, then why was the rod, I guess we'll get into it a little bit here, why was the rod not used to discipline that aspect of myself that was not paying attention? That the rod should have been used, that sort of forceful arm that the legislative body of reproof provides us. Why was that not used? And I think it has to do with the effectiveness of the body of reproof, of that legislative body that I had mentioned, and the quality of wisdom that is gained. Despite the distracted attention, the underlying faithful disposition should be enough to conjure up the trial, let's say. And there should have been enough for me to, and perhaps this is important to think about now, that when this does happen, well, what is the procedure? What is our method by which we deal with the laws given to us by the awareness of reproof, by the awareness of some mistake or wrongdoing. And I think that the the right thing to do is to pause and to think, to remind myself where I am, what I'm doing. It doesn't have to be very long. It could take a couple of seconds. But that sort of thing, I think, takes discipline, and it's not easy to do that all of a sudden, especially given certain complex situations, or if the mind is not adequately warmed up to participate in a particular situation. So, to reiterate, I think my approach moving forward is going to be to pause deliberately. If a word is missed, if a word is slurred, if a word is stuttered over or stuttered through, just sort of like is happening now. If the cause of it is that inattentiveness, or that I am distracted by something else, a different thought in mind, other than what's important or what I should be thinking about. Now, of course, there are certain situations for which stuttering and slurring may have different causes. That is not something that I deny, but of the specific thing that I mentioned here, of the specific events that have happened today, of which I can identify probably one or two. In these instances, I think giving the pause, giving the time to think about what I'm doing, about what I need to say, about the purpose, and to execute on that decision, even if it means to follow the trajectory of the reproof, to turn back to the point of concern, and to prove that, or to reiterate that what I am focusing on, let me do this now. So, as I run into this mental roadblock, not being able to finish this thought, the pause is necessary. And I'll do a verbal pause, let's say. I'll be thinking to myself, okay, so I'm on this path of thought that I am trying to explain how the legislative apparatus of the reproof body is going to allow me to make more effective decisions. It is by returning to the very fundamentals, returning to the point, and my mind is such a bizarre thing, and I wouldn't be doing this in a quick situation, of course, but now that I have the time to do it, might as well. My mind at times, I wish I knew about other people's experiences, but my mind at times may find itself in conflicting wavelengths. These conflicting wavelengths may be enough, and a conflicting wavelength, what I mean by that is conflicting thoughts, that these thoughts collide and then my mind just sort of goes blank. That there's such a difficult experience in trying to regather or regain some lost ground, and then I spend extra time doing that, and then the mind becomes a bit anxious and even more unstable. But even if there's a sacrifice involved here, that I have to say, well, I can't quite remember the path that I was on, let me return to something that is steady. I know that I'm here, I'm trying to determine the truth behind my attention. Let's say in this specific example at work, I'm trying to determine a specific course of action that I'm trying to instruct a person on. And it is by my own individual reproof, as I have stumbled through my words, to go back and to say, okay, this is what is important. There are these set of circumstances. We know this about these circumstances. We should do this to move forward. We do this to move forward because I expect the outcome to be this. If we don't see this outcome, then we have to go back to the previous step and take another step in a different direction and see if we have a positive outcome. So, speaking about the rod now, I had mentioned it earlier in the context of it being this symbol of punishment. There are plenty of different ways I think that the rod is used in the Old Testament. Not all of them have to do with punishment, but in this particular context, I think it has to do with punishment. Or maybe in a more subtle sense or a more sophisticated sense, that it has to do with the execution of truth that the mind has found through that reproof, leading itself to wisdom, let's say. It's kind of a mouthful, but trying to use as much of the vocabulary in this verse as possible. And so when I say execution of truth, staying consistent with earlier vocabulary, it is the lawful arm, just like like police departments are the enforcing aspect of the legislative body. The rod is the enforcing aspect of the reproof of mind, let's say. This is all individual, of course. And so if this process, if this institution in mind now, this reproof of mind, is to be founded, is to be opened, it is to be a functional institution. Let's say if we just imagine for a moment the inside of our mind to be like a mini society, and that one of the key civil or governing authorities of the mind is this reproof apparatus, and also the apparatus of the rod. That now this apparatus of the rod, this is what we were thinking about. This apparatus of the rod, we have to fill out a little bit more. We have to think about it in such a way that we can understand how to make sure that when we go throughout our day, when I go throughout my day, that it's not just the reproof that exists as a strong body, but also the rod, that there is a follow-through. Now, I have to admit, when I started thinking about the reproof, and as I came into this idea of thinking about the reproof as an institution of mind, and then moved from that to the rod, I had felt that the reproof was lacking, but now I think the rod is even more lacking. Of course, the rod is downstream of the reproof, so if the reproof is only semi-functional and there's no enforcement body to back it up, the mind is only vaguely sort of flickering like that UV bulb when it is just initially turned on. If the reproof apparatus is just sort of doing that, there's glimmers of self-correction out in the ether, but it doesn't happen. The legislation is never written, and what's more, the rod has not found its way to a place of execution. Then, I feel that the rod in my case is severely underdeveloped, and this is something that I wish to consider and to think about more, and to keep this a common theme. So far, there have been very steady common things relating to the heart and the spirit, but I'd like to add this one to the aspect of mind. Now, the interesting next step to interpreting this verse is to add the second half of this. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings his mother to shame. So I think the first thing that stands out here is that we are asked to consider multiple levels. In the first situation, I found it quite productive to think about the rod and the reproof as, again, institutions of mind. And as this reflection has unfolded, the focus has been on the singular, on the individual, on my experience. But now we are being asked to consider the broader impact between two individuals. The rod and reproof is something that doesn't just exist in a stationary manner within the singular. It finds itself also permeating through the multitude. Now, the interesting part of this, at least at the outset, is the reflection about the child. It is on the mind that is coming to be. It is continually developing, continually forming. The adolescent mind has a lot of these, has a lot of the precursors to the more mature aspects of mind that we attribute to a fully formed adult. Two of these are the reproof and the rod. Now, there's much variability in our experience. There are many situations for which an adult may understand less of goodness and of discipline than a child, unfortunately. But it is possible, especially given a severe lacking in one domain or another. Now, this is part of what we are asked to consider, prompted to consider, that this brings the mother to shame. But I want to think for a moment, or to continue to think about the rod. The rod is on the part of the adult, on the part of the mother. Let's say a good situation in which there's a good mother that really wields reproof and the rod efficiently in her mind. And because she does this, she is able to transmit everything that she holds dear, everything that she adheres to, all of her principles by which she can act and execute her judgment. That rod of discipline is instilled into the child. The plastic mind is formed by the influence of the parent. And given that this rod forms a significant aspect of our executive faculties, let's say, that it is the thing that holds us. It gives us a degree of grounding. It is the thing that, given our lack of judgment, holds us in place so that we don't commit some egregious error. The impulsivity and the ignorance of a child, although occupies a state of innocence, that state of innocence that we attribute certain positive qualities to. I think there's a certain aspect of the innocence of childhood that is lost in adulthood. A sense of freedom and carelessness that permeates the mind of the adolescent. But nonetheless, it is necessary that as an individual grows, whether it be from adolescence to adulthood or from adulthood to a higher state of being, it is fundamental that the rod, the institutions of mind, have solid authority. And not just solid authority, because solid authority can be truly arbitrary, but we don't want a rod or reproof that is not after the truth. We want to be corrected in the right way so that we can do right things, so that we can do good things. But in a case where it is either severely underdeveloped or developed in such a way that it is misaligned, that the rod was so severe that the execution has rendered the reproof meaningless. And here I think about an extremely abusive family situation in which a parent might suffocate a child to the point of unconsciousness just to serve a point. Now, the reproof doesn't occupy in that child's mind any primary position. It is rather the fear for one's life that occupies the child's mind in that situation. Now, I say that not to be grotesque, but I say that because it's important to highlight the details, the context. Because, like with many things, the thread of truth is thin, and we have to follow it given the context that we're in. While the rod, I believe, is a fundamental aspect of mind, it is something that can be abused. It is something that can be atrophied, that can atrophy. But in the case that we are talking about here, a child left to himself, this is a case of atrophy. The rod atrophies. Now, if the rod atrophies in the child has very poor self-restraint. And by this poor self-restraint, the child does whatever the child does. As they reach adulthood, they still occupy this premature state of mind. And it leads to impulsiveness, poor decision-making, and inability to pay attention. And perhaps inability to attend to that which is good. For my part, I spent a considerable amount of time alone when I was younger. Disciplined to a degree, but I often wonder at what this type of freedom had done to my mind. Out of all of those hours that I spent undisciplined, outside of hours of family bonding, just with myself, by myself. And I think later in life there was some difficulty adjusting to the way of things, learning difficult lessons later than I ought to have. But there's one last thing that I want to talk about before we round this episode out. And that's this idea of shame. There's a certain type of mechanics that are involved here. When we consider the word shame, the definition, on Google at least, is a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the conscious of wrong or foolish behavior. Now, the definition of distress is extreme anxiety, sorrow, or pain. The pain response is quite interesting. Not just consciously, but the input, somatic input as well, I think is interesting. But pain is an output. Pain is the result of information that is received. In this situation, we're thinking about a disobedient child, or rather, the natural product of a child that is left to be, that is left to himself. That uncomfortable feeling is knowing that a mistake has been made, that the faculties of mind were not sufficient to raise a good child, given the time and the environment that was offered the mother or the father. I think it affords, in that case, in the case when a child has really made a serious mistake, a quite uncomfortable but brutally honest reflection about one's own approach to life and to parenting, to their own philosophy, the way that they see the world. And assuming that the parent is somewhat self-aware, I think the impact of this could be quite distressing. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. We are going to continue next time with verse 16.